Hi everyone, welcome to Landscape Ecology, Module 9, Changing Landscapes. This is Yiluan. I'm a PhD student in Dr. Kaiju's lab, working on the responses of plant phenology to global change. Before we start the class, I would like you to recall your earliest memories of the landscape of your hometown and compare it to its current landscape. We learned during the virtual field trip that landscapes, including our campus, are constantly changing. Nevertheless, the changes can be so gradual that they go unnoticed. Fortunately, repeated data collection, such as the one shown in the figure, can help us keep track of these changes that happen. In today's lecture, we're going to look at some examples of landscape changes. After that, we're going to use landscape metrics to quantify the changes in landscape composition and configuration. In the last part, we're going to evaluate the changes in ecosystem services, in particular, carbon sequestration, through quantifying the carbon stock. Landscape changes may occur due to natural variability. The size and shape of Padma River in Bangladesh have been changing for at least decades with massive erosion and sedimentation. This can be considered a natural process, although human activities may also affect the rate of erosion. Landscape changes can also be caused by climate change through sea level rise, plant species migration, glacier retreat, etc. The two pictures here documented a drastic reduction in the size of Yosemite's remaining glaciers over a century. Human activities have greatly altered the landscape. These three pictures show the increasingly urbanized landscape of Buffalo County in Nebraska. In particular, the conversion from prairie to cropland has been intensive on the Great Plains. Now, it's not an easy task to recover the early landscapes. Multiple data sources are often used. We can make use of landscape art, such as the drawing of the Buffalo County you saw in the previous slide. Historical maps and surveys can provide spatially explicit data. We can compare aerial photographs taken at the same location at different time. One example is the Mountain Legacy project. The landscape changes are a lot more quantifiable using remote sensing images, which you can further explore through the NASA Images of Change website. So far, we have been discussing landscape changes qualitatively, but we can use the landscape metrics we learned in the previous lectures to quantify these changes. Landscape metrics are now widely used to compare landscape patterns, but the selection of metrics and the interpretation can still be quite tricky. To recap what you have already learned, there are several guidelines for selecting landscape metrics. For example, we should have particular questions or objectives in our mind. The metrics should be relatively independent. The calculated metrics should span a substantial portion of the range of the potential values of that metric. One method of combining information from multiple measures is to plot the values in a state space defined by a few independent metrics that capture different qualities of a pattern that are relevant to the original question. This figure shows the three-dimensional pattern space. We can now calculate numerous measures of landscape composition and configuration in just a few seconds, but the amount of information produced can often outpace our understanding of how such measures relate to ecological processes. Therefore, we need to think about the ecological meanings of the landscape metrics whenever we use them. Let's try calculating and interpreting the landscape metrics ourselves. This is the landscape of the upper campus that we visited virtually with Alex. The landscape is largely forest cover with patches of chaparral, grassland, and developed land. You may click on the link here for an interactive map. This part of the campus went through intensive industrial logging from the 1860s through early 1900s. Trees were cut to fuel the lime kilns and, if there were any left, later cut to help rebuild San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. The hay barn and today's admission office were both built during this period. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for slash fires to get out of control and burned across large areas of the Santa Cruz Mountains, including what's now on campus. Here's a question for us to think about. What biotic and abiotic residuals do you think remained following these disturbances, including logging and fire? See if your guesses are correct when you visit Upper Campus again. These are two simplified vector maps of the landscapes. At the first glance, the landscape during the Cow Ranch days looks very different from today's landscape. But how do we describe the changes quantitatively? Specifically, we can ask about the changes in the proportion of each land cover type, the landscape diversity, or the edge density. I have processed the maps and obtained the two maps at the bottom. This process of converting vector images to raster images is called rasterization. This is a common step in the calculation of many landscape metrics. Now, let's try and work out these landscape metrics. Please find the link to a handout with this table and some enlarged raster maps. Please note that some metrics are redundant, but still write them down as there are intermediate steps for your calculations. Please pause the video here and complete the table. These are what I got. Please pause here to check if you get the same answers with me. Now, I would like you to rethink about the way I processed the maps. Do you notice any problems? Well, we left out a small patch here, so we are underestimating the patch number. We left out a small but really complex patch, so we are seeing oversimplified patch shape. We also lost lots of details about patch edges, so we are underestimating edge density. This is an example of the effects of scale. Do you recall the two main components of scale? Yes, they are grain and extent. The problems in this example are caused by the large grain size I used, but the choice of extent may also affect the landscape metrics, because patches are cut off at the edge of the extent. In order to calculate the landscape metrics more accurately, I rasterized the maps again using a smaller grain size. The small patches and edges are represented much better now, but it is difficult for us to calculate the metrics manually now. There are some software that can do these calculations for us. FracStats is one of the most popular ones. So I generated the same metrics we calculated using FracStats, but with the new maps. Now compare them with our previous results. How are they different? Do you notice that the metrics related to edge changed a lot? Does that make sense to you? Now we're ready to answer the three questions we raised previously. Let's describe the landscape change from these three perspectives, and more importantly, think about the processes that generated these differences. You may pause the video here for a while before I share my thoughts. Here are some of the trends that I noticed. Firstly, an increase in the proportion of forests is accompanied by decreases in the proportions of chaparral and grassland. This may be attributed to the ending of logging and lowered fire frequency. As we know, chaparral is a shrubland or heathland plant community that's adapted to wildfires, but they may be outcompeted by forest trees at lower fire frequencies. The story about landscape diversity is a bit more complicated. It can be measured from multiple perspectives. When measured by patch richness, which is the number of patch types present, it has increased due to the new patch type, which is developed land. However, when measured by evenness, specifically the Shannon evenness index we just calculated, it has decreased, as forest has become more dominant. Lastly, edge density has increased over time, mainly due to the edges between forest and developed land. Now that we have quantified the landscape changes with the landscape metrics, let's think about the implications of these changes. Here are a few examples that I can think of. The changes in landscape configuration may affect species distribution. The increase in edges between forest and developed land may increase human-wildlife interactions. The changes in relative proportion of land covers change the ecosystem services provided by the landscape, such as carbon sequestration. Now let's zoom in to carbon sequestration. We will spend the last section of this class on the assessment of carbon stock. The assessment of carbon stock, or carbon accounting, is important because vegetation constitutes a large carbon sink. The accurate estimation of carbon stock in vegetation can improve our climate change mitigation strategies. Another motivation for carbon accounting is the trade-offs among ecosystem services. Forest ecosystems do not only store carbon, but also provide timber and food. The picture shows an agroforest in Philippines that combines agriculture and forestry. Through quantifying these ecosystem services, we can weigh the costs and benefits, thus achieving better ecosystem management. The usual method of carbon accounting is to combine forest inventory with allometry. In a forest inventory, we typically record the species, size, conditions of the trees, and so on. One of the most useful measurements for carbon accounting is dBH, diameter at breast height. One of the most famous forest inventory is the Forest Inventory and Analysis National Program led by the USDA Forest Service, also known as the nation's tree census. The earliest FI data can date back to 1930. Although the most accurate way of measuring the biomass of a tree would be to completely dry the tree and weigh it, you can imagine how difficult it is to do so. Researchers have therefore used allometric models to relate tree diameter, height, and other measurements to total tree biomass. The basis of such models is the relationships between the one-dimensional measurements and the three-dimensional volume of the tree. We can then estimate the biomass by multiplying the volume by the wood density. These figures show that there are nice correlations between the above-ground biomass and the stem diameter. Here are 4 allometric models selected for different cases, depending on whether tree height is available or not, and whether the forest is dry or moist forest. You don't have to memorize these. I just want to show you there are so many models proposed that we have to think about which model to use. We should consider things like the measurements available, the biome, the location, the species, and the time to suit the system that we're studying. The website Globe Along Tree has a nice collection of allometric models and allows us to filter them based on all these criteria. Let's come back to our Upper Campus. In 2018, 32 plots were sampled within the study area. Here are some statistics from this survey, and we're going to use them later. Let's use this allometric model for the moist forest stand with no tree height available. Here, AGB stands for above ground biomass, Rho stands for wood density, and D stands for diameter at breast height. With the assumptions on wood density, dBH, and percentage of carbon in biomass, how much carbon is there in an individual tree? Please pause here to do the calculation. Have you got it right? Here, be careful of the unit. Let's now consider the carbon stock at the stand level. From the survey, we also know the tree density, here shown in red. Can we multiply the carbon stock we just calculated by the tree density to obtain the carbon stock per hectare? Why do you think so? A simple multiplication is probably not the best idea. We might encounter some problems when we do such upscaling. Well, the first problem is the use of average dBH. Take note that the carbon in a tree with average dBH may not necessarily equal to the average carbon per tree in the stand. This is because the carbon stock is not proportional to the dBH. Trees with larger dBH have a disproportionately large contribution to the total carbon stock. This is particularly relevant for stands with a wide range of tree diameters. Therefore, we should record the dBH of individual trees and calculate their biomass separately instead of taking average of the dBH. In a highly diverse stand, the wood density may also vary greatly depending on the tree species. You might have noticed the difference in wood density from purchasing furniture. Recording tree species allows us to use species-specific wood density, which can greatly improve the estimation of stand-level carbon stock. You might have noticed that such tree-by-tree calculation requires a lot of data, so researchers have come up with stand allometric equations that are derived from tree allometry. With the total basal area, here imagine cutting a stand at the breast height and taking the cross-sectional area, as well as average diameter, we get an estimate of stand-level carbon stock. In the figure, you can see that the carbon stock assessed using the complete enumeration method and the stand allometry match up quite nicely. Let's try it with our example. Using the stand allometric model and these measurements provided, calculate the carbon stock per hectare. Please pause the video here to do the calculation. Here's what I got. By the way, 1 megagram is equal to 1 ton. So far, we have been focusing on carbon accounting for forests. In order to evaluate the carbon stock of the whole landscape, we need to know the carbon stock of other land cover types. Unfortunately, the allometry for shrublands and grasslands are much less developed than forests. For the purpose of this exercise, I obtained the first 3 estimations of above-ground carbon stock from literature and assumed the carbon stock of developed area to be 0. With these estimations and the areas of each land cover type that we just calculated, can you get the total carbon stock of the 2 landscapes? Please pause the video here and try it yourself. Do you get the same answers with me? Here's an open question for us to think about. It seems that we have lost some ecosystem services, namely timber production. We have also lost some landscape diversity, but we sequester more carbon on this landscape over time. How would you weigh the costs and benefits? After trying out carbon accounting ourselves, I would like to remind you a few points that can complicate the carbon accounting on the landscape level. Firstly, we assumed a constant carbon stock for each land cover, but we know that the carbon stock can change through time. For example, a young forest may store less carbon than an old-growth forest. Therefore, a temporally explicit model can greatly improve the accuracy of carbon accounting. Secondly, carbon stock varies within the same land cover type because of elevation, soil, nutrient, etc. Lastly, carbon stocks are affected by the landscape configuration. For example, forest edges typically store less carbon than the forest interiors. To summarize, we have seen some examples of landscape changes and discussed ways to track these changes. Landscape metrics can be good indicators of these changes, but we have to be careful about the selection of metrics and the interpretation. Changes in the landscape often involve changes in carbon stock, which can be quantified through carbon accounting, but we need to pay attention to the upscaling of carbon stock from an individual tree to stand and then to the landscape level. Thank you for joining me today. Have fun in the rest of the modules. See you.